3rd chapter, beginning with the 12th verse. I often read these words at weddings because it's quite a lovely, just a lovely few sentences about how we're to be and who we're to be as God's people. So hear the word of God. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another. And if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other. Just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in the one body. And be thankful. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Pray with me. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, you who are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So here at Christ Presbyterian Church, surrounded by friends as I am, feeling at home as I do, I feel comfortable at last to tell you, to confess to you, that I am a muggle. I am a muggle. Now, if you are at all up to speed with what's going on out there in the world, you know that the latest movie in the Harry Potter series came out on Friday, The Crimes of Grindelwald. And if you are really up to speed in the world of Harry Potter, you know that muggles are people who can do no magic at all. Harry Potter, of course, is the biggest craze in children's books since Dr. Seuss. For the last 20 years, if you haven't been paying attention, just a little bit of a primer. Harry Potter is a young English orphan who at the age of 11 discovers that he is actually the child of wizards. And he heads off to Hogwarts Academy to learn how to use the magical arts in the service of good. And while he's there, he's joined by his friends Hermione and Ron, and together they figure out how to use these magical powers for good purposes, even while others are trying to do evil. Now, from riding broomsticks while playing sort of like aerial soccer to wearing a cloak that makes you invisible, which sounds actually pretty cool. I could use that. It's all really just great fun. But it's also something more than fun. But it does make being a muggle seem pretty ordinary. For the most part, our lives are pretty ordinary. It's no wonder Harry Potter and his friends are loved by not only millions of kids, but millions of adults too. I mean, we would all love a little bit of magic in our lives, wouldn't we? Just a little bit of magic. But we don't think of our lives as magical, do we? We're pretty much all muggles, living an ordinary life in an ordinary world. But maybe we should look at things just a little differently. Take bread, for instance. Common, ordinary bread. Even if you call it Wonder Bread, it's still just bread. Or is it? Those of us who worship in the Christian faith believe that when we gather and take ordinary bread and break it, that somehow the risen Christ is present with us. It's not so much magic, we say, it's just recognition. Recognition that what seems ordinary may actually be extraordinary. In something as common as bread, we can experience the presence of the risen Christ. If we look for it. There's no magic there, just asking the Spirit of God to open our eyes. This is called a sacramental view of life. Some of you in confirmation class probably memorized this, that a sacrament, like communion or baptism, a sacrament is something in which something visible represents the invisible grace of God. A sacrament is a visible sign of an invisible grace. So it means looking for the ways our extraordinary God reveals himself in the most ordinary things. If you have a sacramental view of life, you're looking for the visible things that make real the invisible grace of God. And you could say that is a really important, maybe the most important thing about faith. Not just that you trust in God, but you see the world differently. You have this sacramental view of all things. Now, Kathy and I have good friends from the first church we served in western Pennsylvania. And we used to meet them in Toledo, Ohio. Toledo, Ohio, that's where you go, right, for fun? Toledo, Ohio, actually, it's got a bad rap. It's got a great art museum. It's got some nice jazz clubs. But the main thing was we lived in Chicago. They lived in Pittsburgh, and Toledo was about halfway there. Well, we were walking one beautiful spring afternoon as the sun was going down. We were walking along the Maumee River, and Steve said, it's the golden hour. Now, I had never heard that phrase before, the golden hour, but I knew exactly what he meant. It's that time right after sunrise and right before sunset, if everything else is right, if the air is clear, that there's just a golden tint to everything. There's a beauty there that is just different than the beauty at other hours of the day. The colors are a little bit different. Everything is fresh, everything is clear, everything is crisp. I'd never heard that phrase, the golden hour, but it was obvious what he meant. And at last, Robert Frost's poem made sense to me. Nothing gold can stay. It goes like this. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her earthly leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. As dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay. Ever since Steve named the golden hour for me, I look for it. And whenever I see it, whenever I'm awake enough to find it, there's a certain peace. There's a powerful peace that comes along with the beauty of it. There's no hocus pocus here. There's no magic. It's just a gift for which I am grateful. After the September 11th attacks, there was a new ad campaign in New York City to try to get tourists to come back to New York City. And the tagline was, "The New York Miracle, be a part of it." Yes, that's a very young Rudy Giuliani that was part of that series of commercials. Now, there was a Chicago Tribune columnist at the time who objected to this ad campaign, and what he didn't like was the use of the word miracle. He wrote this, he said, "The implication of divine intervention discredits the grit and the resolve displayed by flesh and blood human beings. It's not a miracle. It's what ordinary people under extraordinary pressure do." Now, much as I hated then and now to disagree with the Chicago Tribune, I couldn't disagree more. Flesh and blood people are where God does his best work. 2/3 of the Bible is that, the story of God's people doing amazing things because God is with them. That doesn't discredit people at all. It just recognizes the truth that the Spirit of God does, and always will be involved in people's lives for good. And once you frame it that way, once you start looking for it, then you see it. You see it all the time. I mean, you see this in the midst of heartbreaking things. In Pittsburgh, a couple of weeks ago, when people were still stunned by what had happened in their beautiful little community, they went out for coffee to meet each other in the coffee shops, and they found out that the coffee was free. It had been paid for by the people of Sandy Hook, Connecticut, who knew only too well What happens to a community when such terrible violence happens? I was reading about a pastor in Tijuana joined by members of his flock who are handing out clothes in the sports stadium in Tijuana, where this is the new home for some of the migrants that are headed north, and Tijuana now has to find a way to deal with the human need there. And so there are all kinds of people whose names we will never know who are making sure they have something to eat and some place to stay and a place to stay clean. And we're only just now starting to hear stories from these fires, these wildfires, stories of heroism of firefighters, and stories of the ordinary people who are going out of their way to do extraordinary things to make sure those folks have a place to be, a place to eat, a place to get from where they can't go back to wherever it is that will be their next stop. You've seen that kind of miracle in your own life. When the phone rings and there's some faraway voice reminds you that whatever it is you're fighting, whatever it is you're facing, you're not alone in it after all. When you're looking for some kind of wisdom for what to do next or where to turn, and you get it from a friend, from your parent, from your grandson, from a TV show maybe. But the wisdom is there when you need it. You see someone doing something selfless, and they don't know you're watching, but they're doing something sacrificial for someone else. No thought of reward, but you see it, and you know. It's not just a New York miracle. There are Carlsbad miracles and San Diego miracles and Tijuana miracles and Encinitas miracles. And if you name it, if you look for it, you will see it. You will find it. The grace of God working extraordinary things through ordinary people who are, in fact, after all, extraordinary. I remember a speaker at a high school retreat talking about that kind of experience as a God thing. It's a God thing, she would say. And I have vast theological training. We talk about eschatology and pneumatology and all kinds of ologies at seminary, but I really sort of love this phrase, the non-technical phrase. It's a God thing. It's a God thing. When you're in a tough spot and somebody who doesn't owe you anything cuts you a break, you get the job. She shows you a shortcut. He ignores that thing that you said that you never should have said. It's a God thing. When you think no one could possibly understand, and then someone actually listens to you. They really listen to what you're saying instead of just trying to figure out what they're going to say after you're done talking. They really listen to you. That's a God thing. And maybe even when you realize that something you've done or said really did benefit someone else, really made a difference for them, that's a God thing too. You realize that you yourself, an ordinary person, are capable of something extraordinary. And that's a God thing. In Paul's letter to the Colossians, he commands us to be thankful. Interesting, the last thing in that long list, he says, be thankful. Interesting that he commands it. Be thankful. You'd like to think that gratitude would just sort of emerge out of what we've experienced, and often it does. But when it doesn't, and apparently Paul thinks it doesn't always emerge on its own, so he commands us to be thankful, implying that there are times in our lives where we only see what's on the surface. And we need to be encouraged, maybe even commanded, to be thankful. How often do I miss the extraordinary because it comes wrapped up in the ordinary? How often is there a golden hour right in front of me and I'm looking someplace else? How often is there a New York miracle and I'm not paying attention? How often is there a God thing right there in front of me and I don't even see it? We are all looking for magic. But magic isn't really what matters. Magic isn't really what matters, and Harry Potter and his friends, they know it. They know it. The very first Harry Potter book gives you a hint that all the Harry Potter books are about love. And you know, the Harry Potter books end quoting the Bible. But even it's there right in the very first book with young Harry and Hermione there. Harry actually, at the end of that first book, he has to leave Hermione and go alone to face an evil wizard. And there's no guarantee that he's coming back. And Hermione tries to encourage him. Hermione says, "You're a great wizard, Harry." And Harry looks at Hermione confused. He says, "But you're better than I am." And he's totally right. Hermione is a much better wizard than he is. She's much better at spells, much better at potions, much better at all the magical things. But Hermione says, "No, Harry, no. I know potions and spells, but there are more important things, like friendship and bravery." Turns out, Harry Potter, like life, is not really about magic at all. It's about friendship and bravery in the day-to-day living that we all do. It's about seeing the extraordinary grace of God in the most ordinary of circumstances. It's about looking for the golden hour and the New York miracle and the God thing. And when you find them, then it's time to give thanks. So this week, this year, may you discover a golden hour. May you discover a San Diego miracle. May you discover a God thing. May you discover friendship and bravery. And if you do, you will also discover a real Thanksgiving. Not just this year, but always.